and a superclass that has also a constructor. Is the subclass constructor is executed first or called first, or the superclass constructor is called first? This is what we need to know whenever we have inheritance. First of all, constructors are not inherited. But when a subclass is instantiated, the superclass default constructor is executed first. So that means your superclass must have a default constructor, or don't define any constructor and the system will assign one for you. But what happens if the superclass don't have default constructor? Then here we have two situations. If the superclass don't have any constructor, similar to the horse class that we have defined in the previous examples, then nothing will happen and the system will call the system default constructor. The other situation is that there is no default constructor, however, there is another constructor that has an argument, because the default constructor has no argument. Then the situation will be a problem, because the system will try to execute the default constructor and will not find one in the superclass. We will see later how to overcome this problem. Here is an example of a superclass that has a default constructor that prints the message, this is the superclass constructor, and a subclass that also has a default constructor that prints the message, this is the subclass constructor. Now when we create an object from subclass 1, then the system automatically first will call the constructor for the superclass and then will execute or will call the constructor for the subclass. So imagine this is what we are doing. We are creating an object of subclass 1, and now since we are creating an object from a subclass, the system will first call the superclass constructor, default constructor, then will come back and execute the default constructor for the subclass. And this is the output. As you can see, the superclass constructor is first called and the message, this is the superclass constructor, is displayed. Then the subclass constructor is called and the message, this is the subclass constructor. So the system looks for the default constructors. If it finds one, it will execute it. If it does not find one, but no other constructor is defined, it will call the system constructor. However, if there is no default constructor in the superclass and there is other constructor with no argument, then we will show you later how we can call the constructor of the superclass explicitly by using the keyword super. So the question is how to call the superclass's constructor explicitly in a subclass. This is what we want to learn now. As we said before, we use the keyword super in a subclass constructor. Now let us have an example. Suppose we have a superclass that is called rectangle, that represents a rectangle that has the length and width private data members as double, and it has a constructor that initializes the length and width. Also, it has the getters and setters for these two data members, as well as a method that computes the area of a rectangle. The subclass cube, which is extended from the rectangle class, has additional data for height, and it is also a private data member, and the class has a constructor that initializes the width, the height and length of the cube, as well as set and get for height, and two methods, one for computing the surface area and one for computing the volume. As you can see in the superclass, there is no default constructor. However, there is a constructor with arguments. Also in the subclass, we don't have default constructor, but we have a constructor with arguments. So how the system will deal with constructors in this situation? As we stated before, that if you try to create an object from a cube class, then you will have a syntax error because the system will try to execute a default constructor in the superclass rectangle and will not find one. So we need to call the superclass constructor explicitly using the super keyword. So how this is done? Now let us have a look into the definition for the constructor for the subclass, and this is the definition for the constructor. As you can see that before we execute any statement, we need to call the superclass constructor by using the keyword super. So this is similar to calling an ordinary method. You need to supply its parameters. Look at the definition for the constructor for rectangle. It accepts two parameters, length and width. So therefore, the sub constructor will first call the super constructor by supplying length and width, and it will initialize length and width that is inherited from the rectangle class, and then it will initialize the height. So the superclass constructor can be explicitly called from the subclass by using the super keyword. But be careful here, is that calls to a superclass constructor must be the first Java statement in the subclass constructor. Otherwise, you are going to have syntax error. Now let us have a look into the implementation of these classes. First is the rectangular class. It has two private data members, length and width. The constructor, this is not default because it has arguments. Set and get methods for length and width, as well as a method that computes the area by multiplying length by width. Now the subclass, on the other hand, it extends the rectangular class. And notice that we're assuming that we are writing a class for a cube. And you know for a cube that the length, width and height all should have the same size. But here we did not put this enforcement in the constructor. We want to make our class simple. So the constructor will first call the superclasses constructor by initializing length and width, and then will initialize its own private data member height. It has get and set methods for the height, as well as two methods, one for computing the surface area. As I mentioned that we assume that this is a cube, so the surface area is computed by first computing the area of the length and width, then multiplied by 6 faces. And for the volume, it is computed by multiplying the area of the length and width, which is a rectangle, multiplied by height. Let us have a look into a small demo program that shows how to instantiate an object from the subclass cube and how to call the inherited methods from rectangle. This is a smaller program. First, it asks the user to enter length, width, and a cube. And then an object is created from the cube class. Now when the cube constructor is called, remember that the first statement is to call the superclasses constructor to initialize length and width. And now since a cube is extended from rectangular class, then all public methods in rectangular class are available in a cube class. So now if we want to print the length, we simply call the inherited method getLength. And if we want to print the width, also we call the inherited method getWidth. And now for height, it is available in the class itself. And for getting area, this is the inherited method from rectangle. And this is the method defined in the subclass to compute the surface area. And this is how to compute the volume and display it on the screen. As we've mentioned before, is that to instantiate a subclass that extends a superclass, then the system will try to call the default constructor automatically. But if it does not find a constructor in the superclass and there are other constructors with arguments, then it will issue a syntax error. Now here is a situation that we have a superclass that does not have default constructor, but it has a constructor with one input parameter integer. Now in the subclass, there is no call to the superclass constructor. So when you try to create an object from subclass 2, the system will first try to find the default constructor in the superclass. And since it does not find one, then it will issue a syntax error. So this is the situation we have. If a parameterized constructor is defined in the superclass, now when we say parameterized constructor, it means a constructor with argument. Then what you have to do? Now in this situation, you have two solutions. One is that you provide a default constructor in the superclass. So the superclass must provide a no argument constructor. The other situation is that the subclass must provide a constructor, and this is the example we have here. But first you have to call the superclass constructors by using the keyword super. So to solve this issue now here in this example, then in the constructor for subclass 2, the first line you should write super1. And now you are calling explicitly the superclass constructor by supplying 1 as input parameter, and as you can see, it will display the message, this is the superclass constructor and n is equal to 1. So when you try to create an object from subclass 2, what messages will be displayed on the screen? When you write super1, first the message, this is the superclass constructor and n is equal to 1, will be printed on the screen. Next, the message, this is the subclass constructor.